Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome from wherever you're dialing in from. My name is Rosie Levine. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. China Education Trust. Our discussion today takes place upon a backdrop of geopolitical competition between the United States and China. This competition, however, has moved beyond trade and diplomacy, and it has arrived on university campuses, in research labs, in classrooms, and the daily lives of students and scholars. The consequences of how this competition is managed has broad implications for the talent pipeline that fuels innovation and academic creativity, for American universities, and for the US's ability to compete for the global talent that has been a cornerstone of our strength. While these tensions reshape the broader academic landscape, it's Asian Americans and often Chinese Americans in particular who bear the sharpest edge of that pressure, facing scrutiny, loyalty tests, and new barriers. So, this webinar today will examine how the US China relationship is affecting international student mobility, university partnerships, and the global competition for talent. We're looking at the questions: what are the implications? How are students and scholars navigating new restrictions and uncertainties? And how can policy balance openness and US competitiveness? I'm joined today by a fantastic co-host at APA Justice in the Committee of 100 and bringing this conversation together. This is the second of a three-part series in collaboration between these two organizations, and we have an outstanding lineup of experts to guide us through these really complicated topics today. Before I turn it over to our moderator to launch the discussion, just some housekeeping. Today's event is on the record and it is being recorded. Many thanks to those of you who submitted your questions in advance, and please feel free to ask more questions to the discussion and contribute through the Q&A box throughout the conversation. And we'll try our best to get to those. So now I'll turn over to our moderator, Professor Margaret Lewis of Seton Hall University Law School, a distinguished legal scholar whose work sits at the heart of what we're discussing. And Maggie is really one of the leading voices on how we navigate tensions between national security and protection of civil liberties in the competition with China. So now, Maggie, the floor is yours to introduce our panelists and get us started. Over to
Well,
you.
thanks, Rosie, and good evening from a very snowy New Jersey. I am delighted to be moderating this discussion this evening that is organized by a really dynamic trifecta of organizations, USET, C100, and APA Justice. And I want to use all the time we have. I know that we already had questions coming in before we even began the webinar, so I will keep my introductions brief and get into the substance of what we're going to discuss. I am honored to be joined this evening by two panelists. First, Dr. Fanta Ah, who is the Executive Director and CEO of NAFSA, Association of International Educators, having previously held its presidency from 2013 to 2016. And Dr. Stephen Chu, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Physics, of Molecular and Cellular Physiology, and of Energy Science and Engineering at Stanford University. Welcome. So let's dive right in by taking stock of where we are in the U.S.-China relationship and what that means for talent flows before we turn to what might be done to do a better job. So starting with you, Dr. Chu, you've seen global talent flows from many different perspectives as the Secretary of Energy, where you were bringing in engineers and scientists to work with the government, as a professor of physics, but also someone who's done a lot of interdisciplinary work. And how different and in what ways is this moment and the obstacles you're seeing when it comes to this collaboration across borders and talent flows than what you might have encountered at other points in your work in these areas?
I think it's very different. The mood is that first, let me back off and say that without immigrants coming to the United States, coming here mainly to study, but deciding to stay here and raise their families here, U.S. science would be second tier. And this has have been going on since pre-World War II. And we had the full benefit of this. There was a time when many of the Chinese students were seeing opportunities in China going back, but that's also shifted for other reasons, in part because when people come here, they realize that this country is very different than where China is now heading. And so the ones I know who are students, graduate students, postdocs at Stanford and other places say, well, we see our home as here now. But countervailing that, the State Department's sitting on visas. they're not denying, they're just not approving, which is effectively denying. They're making it very clear that not only Chinese, but even Indian students are not as welcome anymore. It's fundamentally crazy. The old saying, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. No, we're shooting ourselves in the head. So it's very bad on many, many counts. In the best interest of the United States, but also international understanding, all these things. Science at the basic research level always benefits from having as wide collaborations as possible. And Congress has not yet realized that it's no longer a one-way street, and it has not been for a decade. And in many areas in basic science, not only technology, but some basic science like materials research, China's in the lead. So we have more to gain.
Just one follow-up, since we have hundreds of people signed up for this webinar from a huge range of backgrounds. Could you just give us the quick brief on what is, when you say basic science and applied, so would you define those for the lay person who's new to these issues of research security and
Yeah,
science?
great question. I'm going to use the definition of Ronald Reagan. And he said that basic science is stuff that you do and all of it's published and it's open in the literature. And so, whereas once you start to think you want to commercialize, you either try to get patents, or the really good important stuff you don't even get patents on, you just hold as trade secrets. And so there's a very clear demarcation between what you can openly publish in literature. And Reagan said, as far as he was concerned, he wanted to make sure that the government support of this science will always be openly published in the literature, open to the wide world. And so I can stick with that one. It's not going to lead to intellectual property. It always does lead to intellectual property rights, but it is thrown out to the wide world, and experience has shown if you do that and everybody else does that, or most people do that, you really enhance and speed up the progress of scientific discovery and the transition from discovery to innovation and finally commercialization.
And I think that's so important, because often people think we're talking about classified research. And of course, classified research does happen, but there's so much more going on that is not something that is directly tied to national security. And certainly, I've gotten a crash course in this as someone who's a lawyer by training and a China studies person, and only got to know folks in the STEM fields doing this work because they were being prosecuted. And so I think this is important that we understand, what we're dealing with. And Dr. Chu mentioned visa slowdowns, visa denials, and you are at the front lines of this. And so from your vantage point, leading the world's largest association of international educators and having been in this space for many years, how would you characterize this current moment, particularly in U.S. China academic mobility, but academic mobility more generally? Is it a rupture, a reset, something else entirely?
No, thank you. Thank you first for having me, and really look forward to the conversation and the questions that also come up. From where I sit, I would say that it is definitely is a reset. I think we're seeing certainly a reset. And this is also happening at the backdrop of the world is changing, and the world is changing rapidly. And I would say even prior to this administration, there were telltale signs of, where mobility is headed, and for a myriad of reasons. And what I would say is that the current situation has been an accelerant. There's no doubt that it has been the accelerant, and we've seen that the kind of ill-advised policies that have come out of the administration, whether it's the visa pause that took place in May, at a time when we have, sort of the uptake of people wanting to come in, and we saw that we never really fully recovered from that. And so this is a time that is a volatile time. And I would also say, I would describe this as, it's not the collapse of mobility, but it's definitely a redistribution of mobility. we are seeing a rebalancing of mobility around the world. And we're seeing that, and in the case of China, but we're seeing that really all around the world. I just came back from the Gulf, and we're seeing the number of institutions that are in many ways, it's the race for the global, it's a race for global talent. And many of these economies understand that you want the best talent and you want pretty much the best brains you can get from around the world. And that is what we're seeing. And the US is definitely falling behind, without a doubt. And so this is sort of the picture that I think we're confronted with at this point.
And some of these policies that we're seeing out of the U.S. federal government are sort of country agnostic. They apply across the board, but of course others are very specifically targeted at certain countries or groups of countries. And it's also on the subnational level that we're seeing U.S. states also limiting their universities' interactions with countries of concern or foreign adversaries, depending on how the legislation defines it. But in your position, you're really interacting with, directly with the students and the academics. And are you hearing pretty consistent concerns about what's going on in the U.S., or is it varying? Is there a lot of texture based on which countries the people have as their passport holder from?
Yeah, no, we're hearing, we're hearing sort of a lot of sort of, I would say, it varies. But the chorus is that there is concern about the state of affairs, and particularly the difficulties and the unpredictability, I think, is the biggest challenge for institutions, for students and their families. And that has been a consistent drumbeat from what we've been hearing across the board. And so that's been one of the consistent messages. Then you add to that the specific travel bans and what those travel bans have targeted in terms of sort of nation states and nationalities and so forth. And that's been definitely an area that we've heard a lot from colleagues about, and certainly from students. And as you said, what we're hearing also at the state level, right? We're going to limit the number of students coming in as international students. We're going to be paying much more attention to what majors students may be coming in with, et cetera, and so forth. And then again, this issue with H-1Bs. That has also implications because a lot of times we know that students who come on an F1, often from F1, because we don't have other pathways really, there are clear pathways to employment. H-1B becomes that pathway. So it's really a consistent message of it's unpredictable. Every day there seems to be sort of a new policy, a new executive order, and so forth. There's not clarity on how things are going to be applied. And so as a result, we're also hearing from prospective students that as a result, they're looking to other destinations. Because this is a high stake decision for students to make, and what you're looking for is predictability, and you're looking also for very clear and consistent signals that you're welcome here.
Before I go back to Dr. Chu, just now, this is the language that you speak. Could you explain to the audience what an H-1B is and why that's so important? Because again, that might not be something that's in everyone's, daily terminology.
Sure. So an H-1B is a temporary work visa that an employer has to file on behalf of a petitioner, and it gives you a period of time that you're able to work in the United States. It requires prevailing wage that has to be met and so forth in relations to that. And universities often will use it for scholars and researchers to be able to be employed at universities. But really, it's also used by corporations and others. Particularly, we've seen the tech sector is one of the biggest users of H-1Bs. And now with these provisions that I've set, $100,000 filing fee for what needs to happen, and all of those things that have come in, and the changes that we've seen around the prevailing wage and so forth, are the complications that this has caused, in particular for those who are looking for pathways to employment post completion of their studies.
Yeah, and I'm going to a conference soon outside the US, and I know people who are foreign passport holders in the US who are hesitant to go because then they have to come back into the US, right? And then on top of that, there's historical memories that I recently taught the Chinese exclusion cases going back, hundreds of years in the US. And one of those major cases arose when someone thought they were okay based on current policies left the United States, and the policies changed while they were outside the United States. So unfortunately, history does at least rhyme and sometimes even almost repeats. Now, the STEM fields, of course, have been hit in a special and more acute way. So, Dr. Chu, I'm just wondering, as you look at the ecosystem, is this kind of uniform across STEM fields? Are there areas that you're seeing hit harder? Are there some areas that are being more resilient? How much is this is just across the board assault on ability to do science?
It's variable. I think there are certain areas that the current administration wants to plow a lot of money into AI things, robotics, things like that. They're retracting all money support from other things like batteries for EVs or utility scale, research to climate change, things like that. That money is now essentially gone and will be gone for the next 3 years. The more disturbing thing is that many of the people in federal offices that are career people and also people in national labs are getting discouraged, forced to retire. Life is being hard for them. You lose those people. And even if you restore the budget in 4 or 5 years, you don't have the workforce. And so it's like a cultural revolution. And what it did to the educational system in China, it took a couple of generations because the mediocre people hire people even more mediocre than them. And then you have this, whereas the very best people always want to hire the very best people because they're not insecure about, working with the best people. And so there's a systemic thing going on as well.
And it's not something that's can bounce back quickly. Once people are gone and they've relocated and they've set up their labs somewhere else, I think part of this too is you don't just flip a light switch and suddenly that whole machine kicks on again in the United States. Like what we're losing is not something you get back quickly or easily. And part of this, I have, I am a lawyer. I do see, I look for security issues. That's part of what I do. And of course, when you do have any kind of collaboration, and particularly collaboration across borders, that comes with some risk and some vulnerabilities. And I know because I'm involved in some of them that there are government initiatives through like NSF's Secure Initiative and others that are trying to find ways to address some of those vulnerabilities that is more thoughtful and prudent and not necessarily just dealing and reacting in an overblown way. But I mean, Dr. Chu, do you see anyone getting it right? Any universities or government agencies that are maybe on the better side of the equation of trying to figure out how to deal with those risks without going too far in the extreme?
That's so tall order when you say getting it right. I mean, right now, the agencies are getting pretty forceful marching orders and going a certain direction. Um, let me answer this very quickly by saying what Congress and the administration don't really realize is that if, for example, if you have foreign students who are there to exfiltrate data before it's published, so you get a year or two head start, and then maybe you can put this into big financial support, let's say in China, that we would be very sensitive to that. It's not in our best interest to see, things that we are not ready to go public on that could be internal within the group for 2 or 3 years. And if we got wind that this was happening, our antenna would go up. And so I don't see any, does it happen? Probably a little at some small scale, but it's not widespread by a long shot. And I don't really see it happening. Otherwise, you get wind of it. All of a sudden, you think if you're coming up with a really radically new idea, not something that's in the wind, usually, if it hasn't been it's not in the wind about to be invented by multiple groups. And so you're very aware that, at least I'm very aware that of some of the things are in that category. I don't see any evidence of that.
Yeah, no, it's good to know. And certainly, Dr. Ah, like one thing that we do with visas is to look for security risks. I mean, I've lived in other countries and I've taken health tests to get into those countries for long term. I've done background checks, whatever it might be. And so to what extent do you think, are there parts of what's going on in the United States that you think do make sense, that there are some policies, or is it something where, where should the adjustments occur? Because we do need screenings. Is it partially just we don't have the enough human power behind it to do this, and so it's a backlog, or what are your top concerns here?
No, I think we can all agree that, national security is something that every nation state takes seriously and should. I think in this current environment and the situation we're talking about, um, it behooves me that in terms of the visa processing, here you have F1 students who I would say are the most tracked because we actually have a system called the Student Exchange Visitor Information System. You don't have that for tourists. You don't have that for other categories of visas. And this was one of the, aftermath of 9/11. And so this idea is where students are, what they're studying, whether they're full-time students, you have all of that information to begin with. So we have a system that's been in place. And then you've decided that, you will institute as part of the visa process, social media vetting. And the social media vetting, for students without really clarity, even still to this day, of what actually constitute social media vetting. And so, of course, students and families are asking a lot of questions. Is it that, because I've had a certain political stance, is that what's going to be the determinant of whether I'm coming in or not? And how does that get determined? So there's a lot of questions that have come in. And it's the question that still needs to be answered is what is the relationship of that to actual national security? That is still not clear. So from this perspective, we've instituted more barriers to entry and we do not have the staffing. There is not the capacity. When you hear students talk about how long it takes to get an interview scheduled, let alone then to go through the process itself, no, there's no doubt that that can be a big deterrent. And particularly, this is happening at a time where if you're going to Malaysia, the Malaysian government has instituted a visa processing that takes a week. More and more countries have accelerated the visa processing, and it's not that they don't care about national security, they do. They've put in place mechanisms. And so, the bigger question is, yes, I think we have technology that can help us do a better job of that. There is not the capacity at many posts to be able to process the volume of requests that are coming in. And with this backlog, it has consequences. And the consequences we've seen with this fall, the numbers. And I've said that the fall was just the starting point because most students had already started the process with applications that were in and admission decisions that were made. We're talking to our colleagues overseas, and we're already getting indications that there's a 40 to 50% drop in interest. That is not by accident. Students have choices, and I think we have to understand that the world has changed. If students are not coming to the United States, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're staying home. There are other destinations that are going to welcome them.
Yeah, and I spent most
Yeah.
of the last year in Australia, and certainly Melbourne and University of Melbourne was doing very well. And so, Dr. Chu, I'm sure you've seen both, if you could, what you've seen with respect to scientists who are not Americans choosing other locations, as well as we are seeing people deciding to leave the United States.
Yeah,
And so
that's
how is that playing out?
really one of the things. It's just not the students and postdocs. There are people who've come here, they've set up shop here, they're professors, they're in companies. If you look at Silicon Valley and you look at the Asians, the Chinese and the Indians especially, it's half the technical workforce. And many of the people in the United States, both in universities and in companies, they're feeling like they're not wanted or appreciated anymore. They're worried about this. And I talked to one person who was a professor at Princeton who could do anything she wanted. She goes back to China there, and she said, I'm now able to recruit people I never thought I would get them to leave the United States. Established early mid-career scientists who are reaching the peak of their productivity, and they're leaving because they're not feeling wanted. and under suspicion. And so the fallout of that side, and the Europeans are trying to get back all the European scientists who've set up in the United States to bring them back to Europe. And so it's all of a sudden where the United States was the first choice, first destination, and we were by default getting all these great people. Now we're seeing, oh, the United States is blowing it. We can bring back talent to our home countries.
And part of this too is the people who are the academics, and of course you say it's also the engineers and the people who are making the things in heaven. In the U.S. you've heard so much about the federal government wanting, for example, to get semiconductors to be made in the U.S. and I do work with Taiwan and I see what TSMC has there, and to recreate that in the United States takes a lot of people who have a tremendous amount of know-how, and that's we're not creating it homegrown in the quantities we need, nor are we bringing it in. But if we did want to turn this around, if counterfactuals, the Trump administration or whatever comes down the road decided that this has been a talent flow issue and we want to bring people back. I mean, how do we do that? Have we had such a hit to soft power in addition to just the money that's going to be really difficult to do, or what would be needed to turn the tide?
Well, let me begin by saying that you have to make this being persecuted, being harassed at airports, people who go and just visit their families. When they come back, they're being harassed by the immigration officials, even U.S. citizens held for questioning for hours. This is really deeply crazy, and it's highly variable depending on where you land. And so you have to establish that no, you're going to treat people fairly and obey the law. If we can start going back to something as simple as that, obeying the laws of our country, that could do a lot to restore it. But right now we're not even doing that.
Yeah, and of course,
And then all the ICE stuff is exacerbating this.
Because you have from a legal perspective, you have the least sort of constitutional protections at those point of entry, the customs and border protection, the people that are there to do the screenings for both the passport and then of course your luggage have a tremendous amount of discretion vested in them. And we've seen this, as you said, that this is not just people who are coming into the US for the first time. This is people who are US passport holders who have left the country for a conference and come back. And Dr. Oz, is this also something you're hearing a lot about, concerns about the crossing of borders and entry points at various airports?
No, we're definitely hearing about that. And again, part of what makes this challenging is whether this is at the scale that is perceived becomes irrelevant. Perceptions becomes reality, right? And so just coming back from overseas, if you are on the outside, the impression you're getting right now on the outside is that there's ICE at every corner on the streets of America, and that basically there's an anxiety about entry, anxiety about safety while you're here in the US, etc. And so part of what has to happen is given this trust deficit. That trust deficit will take time to rebuild. It is not enough that we institute policies that mitigate for this. People have to see it for a period of time to believe that things have actually come back to normal. And I think that's part of the reality that we're confronted with. So we do need to rebuild trust. By the same token, one of the things that has been a real strength for this country is the US has benefited for generations of the brain trust from the rest of the world. And for those who've chosen to go back home, there is still quite a lot of affinity for the United States. And I'm reminded of that when I'm talking to former students, international students who are graduates of American institutions, who have fond memories of their experiences here. They care about collaboration. They care about remaining engaged with the United States. The challenge And they do differentiate between the people and the government. And so part of the work that I think we also need to do is, as institutions, we need to continue to collaborate. We need to continue to figure out how we can build bridges during this very volatile and fraught time, because there are many out there who wish to collaborate. And I keep reminding our colleagues that that's actually quite important. And even at a time of great competition, I'm one who believes that there's shared interest. So the question is, even during this period of time of competition between the US and China, etc., there's shared interests. What are those shared interests that we can actually find points of collaboration on? I think that's an important part of the work that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly I've seen over the course of my career, I first went to Beijing in 1995. So, during like the Jurassic period, right? That so much has changed. Like that was before WTO, and we had, so much just free flowing and movement, between the countries. And you said, one of the organizers of this webinar, I'm working on a working group with them that's really concerned about the decrease in Americans and particularly spending time in China for sustained studies. So looking at area studies and China studies, and how people of my generation and older had the opportunity to really spend time, as my now Gen Alphas would say, touching grass in China, and then bring that information back to business and government. And we're losing that. We're losing that pipeline. And so we're seeing, and Dr. Chu said this, at every stage in people's career, I think we're seeing losses that is, something that is really profound across a wide range of subject matter. But one thing here, so much of this is about what the federal government is doing and ICE and DHS, but it's also about what the universities can do, should do, and Dr. Ah, you're in Washington, spent a lot of time in university settings there, and of course, Dr. Chu, you're in sunny California. Please send us some vitamin D. But what have you seen on the university level that of what university administration, faculty can do, can control? What are some things that we can put out there as some good practices?
Well, let me begin by saying that the universities are in a quandary. Because they are also under siege. The current administration doesn't really believe in them. They think they're elitist. They think that, and they're trying to, the budgets for research, they were proposing factor of roughly two cuts. The good news is Congress is not going along with that. But there are some areas where there's a lot of pressure. And so the universities, instead of, let's say, banding together and saying, no, 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 our values, this is what we stand for. This is what, and it's for the good of the United States. Unarguably, they're not. And so they're being picked off one by one, Harvard and Northwestern and things like that. And it's tragic. Because had the universities said at the very beginning, no, 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 this is crazy. It's not good for the United States. It's not good for anything. It's so much against our best interests. But let me put it on an optimistic side, which is also in peril. I have had over the years, 40 plus years, a bunch of foreign students. Some of them go back, some of them stay, a lot of them stay here. And they say that if you go, let's say, to Europe as a student, or you want to settle in, but you're not born in Europe, you're not born in Germany, or they said you will always be regarded as a foreigner, and even your kids will be regarded as foreigners. And up until very recently, this is not the case. You come here, you're taken as a U.S. person, especially when you get U.S. citizenship, and your children feel none of this. So what is in peril is a deeper trying to stir up mistrust of people who don't look like us, us being white males. And so this is really crazy because this welcoming spirit of we were a big mixing pot, and and you are being taken for your as an individuals and your self-worth, this is at risk. And that's something that we as a nation have to be very conscious of, that the generous spirit of America, if constantly be barraged by misinformation as they are now, they're coming along and say, your life isn't getting better. It's stagnant economically. I'll tell you who to blame. Follow the rule of all dictators. You need an internal enemy and an external enemy. The internal enemy are immigrants. The external enemy, well, China's doing a good job. And so they're just doing this and it's going to have some sway on the public, especially people who are not news hounds, don't read newspapers, get all their feed from, separate bubble chambers, as I guess we all do. But so this is at risk as well.
So, I think from a university perspective, and I also see that there's a question here that I think is an important one. I think from a university perspective, it's safe to say that university, again, as Dr. Shu said, feeling perhaps a bit besieged. We're certainly seeing they're cautious about, sort of former China partnerships. We've certainly seen some of that taking place, and I think that's unfortunate, but that's a reality of what we've seen, some of what has been happening. By the same token, those who have had ongoing partnerships with China, we've seen some who have continued to engage because they see that it's actually quite important to do so. And as a matter of fact, the argument that's come from the administration is that, we're talking about national security. I would argue one national security risk is to have folks who do not know China, who are not engaged with China, who do not speak Mandarin and other languages. That is something they should be concerned about. This is a big world, and you really do need to know the world. And you cannot ignore China because it would be at your own peril. And I think many other nations like this. So I find that that's a little bit ironic that here we're talking about national security and we're not understanding how important it is to know the other and to engage with the other constructively. So that's one issue. In relations to, what is China's perspective on these issues, I would say two things. Having been very engaged with the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C., they've been very keen on wanting to see collaboration going. They want to see more American students going overseas to China, with 50,000 has been sort of the number, providing scholarship dollars to do so. And so we're working with institutions and others to see how we can facilitate that because we actually believe that it is quite important for American students to be engaged with the world. That's one aspect of it. In addition, China, like many other countries, is now a very attractive destination, a destination for studies, a destination for research, and so forth. And I think part of the challenge we have in the case of the US, it's really important for more people to actually go out there and to actually see what's the speed with which change is happening in China, and the progress is staggering. I think you could go every 6 months and you'll see how much has changed. And I do think that that's actually quite important. So from that perspective, I would say two things. One is there's still a commitment for engagement and for mobility and for cross-border exchanges. That is certain. And in addition, China, like many other countries, has ambitions to increase the number of international students who are coming in, and they've come up with a K visa to facilitate researchers and others being able to not only go and conduct research, but also providing funding to support that. China is doing that. Germany is doing that. We're seeing France, UK, all of them are moving down this road of saying we are looking at global talent wherever it is. And we know that it's good for our economy. We know it's good for our engagement with the world.
Yeah, and I was last in Beijing in December, and I know that under the 50,000 initiative that there's a lot of American students going. I will say the concern as an academic on the U.S. side is the not the quantity is high, but what is the quality of that visit? Because there's a lot of short-term visits, and that's a wonderful
I
introduction,
agree.
and it's very important to meet people, on the ground. But ability to really do field research, to access archives is it's a very tightly politically controlled environment. So one of the hard things that we're, all those of us who are in the China studies field is trying to figure out how to make sure that we have a rich, deep, really meaningful interactions. And yes, it's important to just keep people moving. That's better than nothing, but it's not enough. And to Dr. Chu's point, one thing too that I was just recently talking in my class about the Japanese internment and the annual remembrance of the executive order that allowed that to occur. And my family's in Portland, Oregon, and has a really moving tribute to 100,000 plus people who were relocated, most of whom were U.S. citizens. And certainly then this idea of the perpetual foreigner is something which has come up repeatedly with different groups coming to the U.S. and that would be so sad to see that part of the U.S. history to come to the fore again when we have had such a wonderful tradition in this country too of welcoming immigrant groups and seeing that as well. So I think we're going to go to Q&A in a few minutes. So just I don't want to be all doom and gloom, which is this is a subject that we can do that, and we've got so many people who have signed on tonight, and this webinar will be posted. And so if you can maybe for the people out there who want to help and aren't in your positions, but really want to be useful to try to make it so the U.S. not only has thriving academic ecosystems, but is a welcoming place. Any advice, tips and tricks? What can we do?
I, I would say we need to tell the stories, and we need to tell the human story here. There are infinite number of examples of folks who have made significant contributions to this country. Their names, there's stories behind that. And so I do think one of the things we can do and we have to do is we do need to have a counter narrative to the current narrative. And we need to be intentional about that. And we should be relentless about that. That's one of the things concretely we can do. And we need to do that at the community level. We need to do that at the state level. We need to do that at the federal level, because when all is said and done, there is no substitute for people-to-people connection. And that's where I think is one of the concrete things that I would say that we can do, and we're not powerless when it comes to that.
One of the amazing things, the last time I was in China, I toured two of their industrial factories. One was Xiaomi, it's a phone company now making cars, and another was a wind turbine factory. And these guys are telling me what they're doing, even their quote company confidential stuff. And what they've done, essentially, if I stand back and look at it, is if you turn back the clock 100 years, the United States wasn't a scientific powerhouse. Europe was. But we took what was being discovered in Europe and industrialized it. Henry Ford started to make cars. He didn't invent internal combustion engines or even the assembly line. But he drove down costs and he said, my goal is to make a decent car at a much lower price than Benz, Volkswagen, or Peugeot or someone else. Okay. And he did it by vertically integrating his industries, make all the stuff from the paint to the steel to the you know what. And I'm looking at China and they're doing the same. But they're also innovating, deeply innovating in these companies. And they're, and out of all the inventions, there, strews patents going out and they're excited. And I'm thinking, we should go back to the American playbook of 100 years ago, rather than saying the way we're going to compete is have tariffs and close off borders and stop. He said, no, we have in ourselves to have this competitiveness. You have to be lean, you have to be hungry, and you really have to want to do this. But that spirit, I think, is still in America. But the solution is not, immediate protectionism and things like that. The solution is, okay, let's return back to what we did so well, and we can do it again. And that, I think, is the attitude the United States government should take. It's the attitude that many businesses in the United States still feel that, look, I do battery research. Why? You might ask, why am I doing battery research when there's CATL that's a multi-trillion-dollar evaluation and they're putting a ton of money into battery research? They're forming a Bell Labs for batteries. And the answer is, well, because you can come up with some crazy ideas they haven't thought of.
I mean, my great Finnish great grandfather came to the U.S. to go to the World's Fair as an engineering student, and then so exactly like this story has been
Mhm.
repeated in so many different ways, and he stayed because it was more dynamic to be here than to be back in Helsinki, right? And so capturing that spirit and one thing when we've got a question about given how difficult it is to rebuild knowledge, and once you cut off the flow of people and the flow of funding, asking, do lawmakers do they understand that this is an issue that must be addressed immediately? And I certainly have thoughts on that, but I'm wondering if either of you, can answer that, and also what arguments, as people can reach out to their members of Congress or their other, subnational lawmakers, are there arguments that we could make louder, better, differently?
So, as part of our work and mandate, we do a lot of advocacy and public policy work. And there are several things that have emerged for us. One is that we need to continue to provide the evidence to what the true cost of this is, the human cost, the economic cost, the long-term cost of relationships with China and with other nations. And so part of that has been we've taken, for example, immigration economists to the Hill to talk about what the loss is. But it used to be that in the past, we would talk about the loss in just national terms. We've now come to realize that that is not enough. We need to be able to talk about it even in terms of state, what it looks like at the state level. And so we are finding that when we do drill down to the state level, that it is resonating more because it's hitting home closer. So that's one example of things that I would encourage us to continue to do. We do need to talk about how this is affecting real communities in real time, how it's affecting states, how it's affecting our nation as a whole. We need to do that, and we need to be able to tell those stories through different mediums, including local papers and others. I think that's an important part of the work that I think we can do. The other thing that we do need to do, I know for us in the world of international education, is build alliances across sector, right? Because we know the business sector cares about these issues, so we do a lot more work with them because I think cross-sectorial aspect of advocacy is actually quite important. And so that's another aspect of the work that we are engaged with as we move forward. Are they paying attention? Yes. But also, as I think Dr. Shu mentioned, there's an environment where there's a lot of fear. There's fears of reprisal, there's fears of all of that. And so we're trying to often talk about how do we break through that? What are some shared common areas of interest? And I think that's one of the things that we're spending quite a bit of time on. It's a work in progress for sure, but there's a lot of work to be done.
And one of the things to remember also is that this collaboration among scientists, engineers, goes very, very deep. In the deepest part of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis, came very, very close to a nuclear war. And it was the back channels of American physicists who were bomb designers who had personal friendships with the Soviet bomb designers that they could cut through this and say, no, look, because if you don't know what anyone's doing, your goblins rear their head and your suspicions. And so it was this backdoor channel that said, we're not going to do anything stupid. That personal relationship among scientists and academics is a real resource. It's a form of diplomacy that you don't want to give up. And so that's something we have to remember that historically it's kept us from disasters.
Yeah, and just how that provides ballast in the relationship
Right.
to have those connections. And I know one concern with the U.S. China relationship is that as there's less of that flow of people, that we don't have as ready pick up the phone, send the email, the WeChat, whatever it might be to make those connections. Now, just one thing on the subnational level, I want to give a shout out to APA Justice, which has done such a great job of really organizing people within, a number of states that have seen whether it be restrictions on land ownership, other really concerning state level legislation, as well as, the lawyers. ACLU has been in court in Florida. They've been in court all over the place. There was just a win in Tennessee that the ACLU was behind that was concerned about how foreign nationals were being treated. And so this is really a multi-front, multi-pronged effort. But particularly with U.S. and China, and in the mention of the Cold War, it was the U.S. and USSR. It was a totally different time as far as how global economy was integrated, flow of people, and we are looking to a 2026 where President Trump and President Xi could meet three, four times, when maybe even as soon as April. And who knows what's going to come out of any of that. But if you had a wish list, if you had something that you wanted to have come out of a Trump Xi meeting that would be helpful to address some of these concerns, what would be some sort of high level messaging or other something deliverable that we could maybe want to see from that interaction?
On my end, I would say the best investment that both countries can make is to ensure that the exchange of researchers and students absolutely not only continues, but that we actually double down on that. That would be one thing I would love to see come out of their exchange in very concrete ways. And that in order to do that, we have to remove many of the barriers that currently exist on either side. I think that would be one of the things that I would love to see from a high level messaging.
One of the things I'd love to see is there's a danger that led by the current administration and president, that you're going to divide the world into spheres of influence: an Asian sphere of influence, a Russian sphere of influence, and American sphere of influence. And and again, contrary, what happened after World War II is America did something that was unheard of. Rather than being a bad winner, as was done in World War I with England and France, to punish your enemies, we rebuilt Germany, rebuilt Japan. We told Europe, we will, as you saw the emerging Cold War in the late 40s, early 50s, we say, don't worry, we will protect you. And that trust and this protection is now, Europe is now saying, I don't think we can depend on the United States anymore. Should we be developing, we being Germany and Japan, believe it or not, do we need to develop our own bombs, hydrogen bombs? So this is crazy, that this whole world stability let's not go to war. Let's not have a deep dark Cold War or a warm war, because it's gonna set the world back by a lot, and so everybody's gonna lose in this.
And there's going to be competition, but competition
Sure.
isn't a bad thing necessarily. We can even have a rivalry, maybe not a heated rivalry, but a rivalry. But I think that's part of how do you manage that competition. And one of the questions we have is about the students who really feel caught with these geopolitics, and what can they do? What can universities do? I mean, and even, is there any concrete things? Like, I've spoken with students about, making sure when they're traveling that they have a letter from their university explaining their role. And because even if English is your first language and you're someone who has legal training, it is very intimidating to be asked questions by someone who works for the US government when you cross a border. So, yeah, what are some things that the students can do in the universities to support them as they try to keep moving across borders?
Right.
It's, again, one of the key things is universities need to have accurate information, particularly given the speed of so much change. It's making sure that they're kept abreast of the developments and the changes that are happening. So one of the ways we've done that is we have sort of a one-stop at NAFSA where all of the changes that affects on the immigration side, students and scholars, you can go and you can see exactly what's happened. When there's an executive order, what does it mean? How does it translate and so forth? So first and foremost is information and having accurate and timely information. Two is communicating very clearly and consistently, I think, with students about what the options are, how do you prepare yourself, what is the documentation that is needed, and so forth. I think that's actually quite important. And that is communication. We cannot over communicate. I would say, in addition to that, particularly for students who will be crossing borders, this was me when I was an international student once upon a time. It was the advice that I would always give when I was the designated school official at my university. It is better to have more documentation than not. So there's things that we can put in place, and we need to be consistent in doing so with our students during a time where there's so much a confusion, the speed of information, and so forth. I think that is actually really quite important. The other piece about this is, you know, we are limited in some ways because in some of these policies or directives that are coming like executive orders, their their pronouncements are made, but there's really actually not the deliverable piece that are there, right? And so it does take some time for that information to be readily available. But this is also, if students have trust with their institutions, then they can understand that sometimes we may not have that information readily available, but we need to be as truthful as possible with our students during a time when they're deeply concerned.
We have a few minutes left. Dr. Chu, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is the research security side of this, that one of the concerns too is that as we amp up research security, and particularly if there is the general counsel's office and people who are research security officers who come from like export control backgrounds, our tendency is just to add more requirements, more paperwork, but then that's less time in the lab. And so any, closing thoughts about what the universities could do better or what we can, maybe put in for the next webinar that we're going to do in this series down the road?
Well, first, is there some exfiltration of data going on in the United States? Yes. But, really, the extent of things like that, uh, I think it's being over exaggerated. But I don't. But I think in terms of national security, Ronald Reagan was very clear on that. If it's really getting to the border, it's classified. Okay, and I have no problem with that. You just classify it. Now, in universities no longer really do classified work in universities, but there are other outlets. There are, uh, JPL, the Lincoln Labs, all these other places, Air Force. So there are places where you can actually get university talent to work in these areas as well. But just have an overall thing that, because everything has a dual use in technology. And so that's the thing I think that we need to remember, that there's a lot to be gained, especially in the basic research areas, as it gets more and more to commercialization, more and more to trade secrets and things like that. Sure, the companies do what they want. They want to protect their own economic interests. The United States should be doing these things to make sure that vital industrial processes don't get leaked out. And I'm all for that. Most of the spying is industrial spying. It's not academic spying. And the industry knows this. Is there some I can probably, but if you think that you all lump this into the same basket, it's not there. And so we have to be very careful about being overly paranoid. And I don't want to overemphasize that the American people over 50, 80 years have brought up a lot of goodwill in the world. This is at risk. And we still are a welcoming country. We're still a welcoming people, but enough bad information to stir up paranoia, you can destroy that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great caution to end on and to activate all these communities that are doing such good work. And thank you to you both for taking time out of your afternoons and evenings to join and my gratitude for all the work that folks are putting in behind the scenes as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Cindy Tsai, the Executive Vice President of C100, for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Professor Lewis, Dr. Ah, Dr. Chu, for this evening, this morning, and this afternoon's wonderful conversation, very insightful, and we just really appreciate your time. Just as a reminder, this recording will be made available in APA Justice, Committee of 100, and USAID's website, as well as YouTube channels. For those of you who missed our first installment of this series, please feel free to jump on our websites and YouTube to watch that first one. We hope that you'll join us for our next series where we'll talk about how U.S. foreign policy and geopolitical tensions are affecting the day-to-day lives of all American people. Please do stay connected with us. If you would like to support our programming, the QR code is on our website. And if you don't mind, please do complete our post-webinar survey. We do look at it very carefully and it'll help us in development of our future programs. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of the day.